So the anthropological question in the 19th century was, how did this come about? Why was it that the world as a whole was a pushover for Western imperialism? And the answer that was generally found was, well, we must be smarter than the rest of them. I mean, we have a culture that is based on reason and science and not on superstition and myth and religion, and which is part of the answer. But then the question, well, why do we have that? Why do we have this cultural superiority? And before long, the fact that the people exercising this superior rationality were white and the others were brown and yellow and black built into a biological explanation, a racial explanation of this inequality. So that the anthropology of the 19th century was concerned with explaining how world society had become formed as a racial hierarchy. And there was no question to the participants that this was an ongoing process. There was no point in looking at it as something that had stopped, that was somehow finished, that could be described objectively. It was a historical process. It was something that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. The end was almost certainly in the future. And it meant that, therefore, that the anthropology of the world as a racial hierarchy was very much concerned with questions of origins. Where did it all come from? What was the origin of marriage? What was the origin of racial difference? What was the origin of society, and so on. So the basic vision of anthropology in the 19th century was an evolutionary one. It was concerned with how society was evolving. It was based on a premise of fundamental inequality, and it took as its basic paradigm history, indeed world history. So it was this concept of anthropology that was overthrown by the birth of the modern anthropology of the 20th century. And I mean, the ethnographic movement had its roots in all kinds of contradictions associated with Western imperialism and its decadent form in the decades leading up to the First World War. But it was the First World War and the fact that the alleged cultural superiority of the West had led to the death of millions irrationally in the trenches that undermined this basic premise. And it's interesting that when Malinowski published Argonauts of the Western Pacific in 1922, which was a sort of launch of the new ethnographic anthropology, at least in this country, the most popular film of the day was one by Flaherty called Nanook of the North, and it consisted of a resilient Eskimo, Inuit, or whatever, fighting against the elements and doing pretty well. And people flocked in their thousands to see this movie, which to some extent captured even more effectively than Malinowski's monograph the notion that maybe these people know something that we need to learn from, and that we've previously excluded because of because we assumed that they were backward and that we had nothing to learn from them. So the idea of going to live with people where they are, of finding out what they think and do, of getting out of the university, getting out, spending longer time with people everywhere, it was obviously and is still, I mean, the most energizing and revolutionary step that anthropologists took but it was consistent with the turn of world society in the 20th century, which was away from a conception of the unity of humanity in terms of human nature or in terms of a common history, however unequal, towards the notion that society was located principally in fragments which were local, whether conceived of as nations or as ethnographic communities living within bounded space and with a degree of cultural homogeneity, which took its inspiration from the nationalist presumption that society was best organized at the local level by people who share the common culture and devised the political means of expressing that. So what I build, I mean, it's been obvious enough for several decades that anthropologists have been struggling with the implications of this revolutionary break with an evolutionary history which was discredited by its association with Western imperialism and racism, and the development of an ethnographic model which had as one of its corollaries a loss of any overarching vision of what it is that humanity shares, and in particular of any historical vision of world society. Now, the last 3 decades, as you all know, produced an overarching commitment to the notion of a world society driven by certain homogeneous, largely economic forces. And I think it is reasonable to claim that world society has become more integrated in the last 2 or 3 decades. I mean, I would point to 3 developments in particular, just of the last 2 decades. One was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which opened up the world as a whole to transnational capitalism and neoliberal globalization. The second was the emergence of the peoples of India and China as economic powers in their own right, and with immense implications for the distribution of economic power ultimately in the world. And the third, of course, was the expansion of the internet as a means of global communication, the rapid reductions in time and distance that opened up and accelerated the notion of greater interdependence and social coherence at a global level. Now, this was clearly linked to a particular drive to open up the world to free flow of capital. The chief instrument of this in the 1980s were the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, who imposed on weak governments around the world the necessity of scaling back their public expenditures and services and opening up or reducing the barriers to the free flow of capital in and out of countries around the world. I mean, this was called structural adjustment, as you may know. This was largely successful in terms of its specific aims, but it introduced a certain measure of instability to the economic regime which had succeeded the one that existed after the war. I